Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Sporty's webinar on Talk to an Air Traffic Controller. My name is Brett Kobe. I'm here at Sporty's Pilot Shop in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'll be the facilitator this afternoon. Delighted to have RJ Ratliff with us out of Cincinnati Air Traffic Control and Indianapolis Center. Will be our resident expert on all things ATC to discuss this topic with us today. We've had over 700 questions sent in from pilots among the group here, and those all over the U.S. with lots of very good and thoughtful questions to ask. So we're going to organize this and have it organized into kind of 9 main subject areas based on topic, ranging from terminal operations to en route operations, IFR, VFR topics like flight following, and then some more advanced technology topics that Roland will share some insight on, like ADSB and how that's affected the controller's job and some of the next gen type technology that's in the works here. With that, I want to welcome RJ Ratliff. RJ, welcome to our webinar today.
Hello, glad to be here.
Known him for a couple of years now. We work together here in the Cincinnati area. He's our primary point of contact with the operations here at our Sporty's Academy Flight School. Has a wealth of experience that he'll share here with you shortly, but works out of both Greater Cincinnati International Airport, which is a Class B airport, CVG, rapidly growing with lots of freight operations in addition to the air carrier operations, but also has a unique qualification and spends a lot of time up at Indianapolis Center, so well versed in both the terminal and en route procedures. Also a private pilot, which I think is great, brings a unique perspective to this, both from our perspective as pilots and flight instructors and how we deal with ATC. With that, RJ, I'll turn it over to you just to give you time to talk a little bit about your background and your experience.
Great. So I started as an air traffic controller at Fort Worth Center. So I actually started in the en route environment. At Fort Worth Center, I had many roles. Started as just an air traffic controller. I was in traffic management for a little while. When your flight's delayed or you're in a ground delay program, that's traffic management. And that's part of what we are doing. We're managing the traffic that's in the sky and making sure that the levels of traffic in a given area or for a given airport are that we can still maintain safety. And that's what traffic management is. I was also an operational supervisor at Fort Worth Center, but I'm from Kentucky. And I made my wife a promise that we come home one day. So I transferred to the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport around 7 years ago and became very fluent in the terminal and tower areas of the air traffic system as a controller, as a supervisor. And about 2.5 years ago, I was promoted to a district position. So even though I'm with the Indianapolis district, I am out of Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport. I actually don't work per se in Indianapolis Center. I work for the Indianapolis district. So what the new district's concept is, it's something that's the air traffic version of the FAA is dealing with right now. And that is Indianapolis Center and all terminal facilities underneath it. Everything from Evansville, Indiana, all the way over to Charleston, West Virginia, from Columbus through Lexington, Kentucky. So it's a very large area. I mainly handle the terminal facilities, but also do help the center and their aspects and do go up there quite a bit, as Brett said. That's my current position. I love doing runway safety action team meetings. We do a lot of those around the districts, and I also help contract towers out. I am, believe it or not, I am IFR rated, but I haven't been current for quite a while. But I do belong to the Cynthiana Flying Club, flying group down here in Cynthiana, Kentucky. So I do a lot of single engine flying.
I've heard some stories too from other controllers at Greater Cincinnati that you like to fly your 172 over to the 10,000 foot runways at CVG and get graded by the controllers on your landings.
Yes, I've gotten some. I don't think they can see me from the tower. I'm going with that. They didn't see anything, but yes, I have been known to do some touch and goes at CVG.
That's great. Some of the questions we have coming up later relate to GA pilots like ourselves flying in the busier airspace. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. That's fantastic. It gives everyone here a good overview of your experience and one of the most well-qualified, pilots and controllers I think we could possibly have for this presentation today. I want to cover a quick overview of just the topics I mentioned earlier. As you can see here, we're going to try to hit a little bit of each one of those. We have about an hour today, may run a couple minutes over, but we'll try to stay well focused and dedicate some time to each of these as we group these questions together. So, RJ, let's start out. One of the most common questions among pilots, and I know there's a big push right now among the FAA and ATC in general to bring on new controllers. Talk a little bit about the process of how do you become a controller, and age groups and background experience. What's the system looking for currently with new controllers?
There's actually a bid for controllers either out right now or about to be unveiled. And I highly recommend, if you are looking to be a controller, to visit FAA.gov. And the job posting will be posted on that site or on usajobs.gov. They don't really announce very far ahead of time when these are coming out, even to internal FAA employees. But they say, hey, we need controllers. And if you meet the qualifications, sign up, submit a resume, and put your name in the hat. It does require either some educational requirements or work requirements. A college degree is not required at this time. It used to be the old CTI system, which some people might find. That system they've gotten away from that more and more. That's what I had to go through back in the day, where it was called the Collegiate Training Initiative, where we actually had to go to certain universities across the country in order to be hired. UND on your screen is actually one of them.
Okay. Yeah, we visited there a couple years ago, and they have a really impressive facility and tower simulators and approach control simulators. Now, I know there's an age limit. What is the current restriction in terms of age?
So you have to be in by your 31st birthday. You have to be hired by the FAA by your 31st birthday. Minimum age, I believe, is 18, but please don't quote me on that.
Okay, yeah, close enough. But there's a top age limit, which I had heard before.
Correct. Yep.
What about training that you mentioned? How long does the training usually take after the time you're selected to the time you're actually controlling aircraft?
So training depends on the facility that you get hired into. The first stage of training is everyone except for military hires go to the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. You'll be there about 3-4 months, once again, depending on the type of facility you're going to. You'll then report to your facility, then you'll start training. Starts with classroom. You have to learn airspace. You have to learn maps, frequencies, letters of agreement between different facilities, and the rules. Then you're going to go progress to what's called simulation training. Some facilities are lucky enough to have high fidelity simulation training. Those are really neat simulation, either tower simulators or radar simulators, depending on the facility. So some facilities are lucky enough to have that. Then you will go to the floor, is what we call it. And that's when you're talking airplanes, and you'll train there anywhere, depending on the size of the facility. It could take a year. It could take up to 4 years, sometimes less, sometimes more.
Okay, that's good to know. Now I know you and I have talked. Again, you're in the unique situation of being a private pilot and instrument rated
Mhm.
and a controller. What percentage of, I'd say, both new hires and then maybe some of the more experienced are actually pilots that we're talking to on a daily basis?
A surprising low percentage. Most are not. Most are not pilots. I, if I was to put it into a percentage, less than 20%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, and you hear the story of the caravan pilot down in Florida, where the controller was able to talk,
Hmm.
a flight instructor I think talked the pilot through. So if I'm talking and on the frequency with Indy Center or Cincinnati Class B, and the person I'm not talking to is a pilot, is there good odds that maybe at least one person around is a pilot if I had something come up that they could find someone in the building that's a pilot?
Yes, and that's what we try to do. Anytime there's an emergency situation, the facility is going to utilize any resource that they have available. So they are going to try to find, hey, does anyone have any pilot experience? Does anyone have any pilot experience in this aircraft? And we're going to try to find that and help the individual out. There are many stories. There are very, very few as extreme as the one down in Florida, but there are many stories where we'll bring a pilot into the situation and say, hey, how can we help this individual? Even if we don't have somebody in the facility, we might pick up the phone and call the flight school or call another facility and see if they know anyone that's an instructor and try to find help for that individual.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, it is probably pretty rare. And obviously the Florida case got a lot of press just
Mhm.
due to the circumstances and the very favorable outcome. And I think it's a testament to the facility in Florida, Miami Center, and the local approach to be able to coordinate all that. And that's
Mhm.
something I always remember too. In terms of crew resource management, that even if the person you're talking to isn't going to be the one that helps you, disclose what's going on in an emergency or some kind of abnormal situation, because you're not alone. There's somebody there that has your best interests at stake also
100%.
in that process.
100%.
So when a controller, let's talk about a radar controller, whether it's center or approach, common question, they want to know how many airplanes can that one person manage at a given time?
That's a very loaded question. Volume doesn't always equal complexity. That's an air traffic mantra. You can be really busy with one aircraft, or you can be kind of calm with 20 aircraft. It just depends on the other factors in there, the complexity side of it. Is that one aircraft having an emergency? What are their needs in this emergency? How many resources are being devoted to that one aircraft? Most air traffic controllers want to stay in the, I would say, the 10 to 15 aircraft range. In the center, it's going to be a little higher. There are certain parameters where you do try not to overload a sector. Me personally, I think my highest is 38 at one time.
Wow. Now a lot of that, I'm sure, like you're saying, if you're at a busy airspace where a lot of turbine aircraft, airline, corporate jets
Yes.
are on an arrival procedure, especially some of the descent and climb via procedures, they're self-sufficient. I'm sure that allows you to have a higher volume and just kind of monitor what's going on there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So another question that came up frequently relates to kind of two parts to this. Both controllers talking very quickly, which I think can intimidate some pilots, that they can't find the right time to chime in on the mic. And then also the aspect of foreign pilots coming in, not knowing English as their first language. But what advice do you have for pilots who are intimidated by the controller in those busier times, or with that first English language situation, to make sure that the communication happens efficiently, but to keep the pilot feeling welcome as well, that they belong there and can take advantage of the services?
This is going to sound counterintuitive for your question, but number one, visit a facility. And I bet that's in a slide that you're going to show later. But I'm going to say visit a facility. Learn that the people on the other side of that microphone are just like you. They're normal, everyday people that just happen to have a really cool job. And that's a big part of it, is to remember that the controllers are people too. Now, yes, there are times when it is busy and it might feel intimidating. If you do hear that it is really, really busy and you're having a hard time getting a word in edgewise, are you just asking for a small request that maybe you can wait a little bit? If so, then wait that little bit. If you're in an emergency situation, you're probably the most important thing that that controller doesn't know. So at that point, you do need to step in because they need to know that information in order to be able to help you out. And if that is the situation, they can get more resources in there. A lot of controllers do talk fast. It is just part of the job sometimes, and we kind of get in that cadence as a profession as well. So feel free to step in if you need to step in, but don't be scared to ask. That's the number one takeaway. Foreign pilots, they do pose a challenge. Of course, we all do know that air traffic, the international requirement is English is the primary language, or is the language of air traffic between pilots and controllers. That's a luxury that we have here in the United States. A lot of foreign pilots just know the pilot controller glossary and not much more outside of it. So we have to be more patient as air traffic controllers, and we have to stick to the book, to the standard phraseology, and listen for those keywords. It's just a thing that you have to speak a little slower on both sides to get the information you need.
Okay, I think that's great advice, because from the pilot side, there's different levels of priority and requests, and the kind of the required reports and check-ins versus things that are more convenience. And so from a pilot standpoint, if we can prioritize what we're trying to get across. Before moving on, I want to just touch on one last thing, which I know you're very happy to discuss and have helped us here with local tours of the greater Cincinnati TRACON and Tower. You mentioned one of the best things a pilot can do is visit an ATC facility. What kind of general guidance do you have for those across the U.S. and their local either center or Class B or C airport to initiate that contact and request a tour?
To initiate, the Green Book, the AFD, as we all know it, or used to know it. Now it's all built into ForeFlight and airnav.com and everything else that we have out there. But the old green book is still out there in that publication, and most of it is on airnav as well. Or you can just Google your local airport identifier and put phone number. Call the facility and just let them know you're interested in a tour. Who do you need to speak to? And they'll usually put you in touch with someone. There are some more requirements right now with COVID that facilities must abide by. Some facilities may not be able to offer a tour right now, but they'll tell you what their current requirements are and help you out with the tour.
Okay, good. And I know you're a testament to this, that you reached out to us here and other airports in the Class B underlying airspace saying, hey, we're available for tours, come visit us. And it sounds like you enjoy having pilots out just as much as pilots enjoy visiting you as well.
Absolutely, because it does give, as we mentioned, a lot of controllers are not pilots. So it gives both an opportunity to say on each side what helps them. The number one question we get, and this is on a side note, from student pilots, is does it bug you when we say with you? And to me, that cracks me up. I never thought about it in my entire career until student pilots started asking me that. And maybe it's just 40 student pilots, I don't know. But I know this is also in another slide coming up, so we'll go in depth and more about what do we want to hear. When you tour, you get to hear that from a lot of controllers at one time say, hey, this is what helps us out.
Yeah, I think the with you thing started in the last 10 years with the proliferation of internet comments, that forums,
Yes.
and a lot of people with their opinions, and a lot of debate, and a seemingly simple couple of words has really triggered that debate a lot. And it is funny. It's funny to hear your impression there as well.
Yes, and Kilo's the one that gets me. I know that. Well, let's go local. In the Northern Kentucky, Southwest Ohio, we have Cincinnati Lunken Airport, and it cracks me up every time a pilot goes Kilo Lima Uniform Kilo. It's like you're 2 miles away from it. If I don't know where that is, we got bigger problems.
So let's just clarify. You're saying, and I think I've heard this from others, that just go with the 3-letter identifier. You don't need the ICAO K.
Correct.
Got it.
Yes.
So just
Yeah.
when you're talking with the controller, now let me ask you this, because you mentioned we're local. What if I'm in a higher speed aircraft and I'm requesting an airport that the controller may not know about? Is the kilo important there, or kind of assume the same thing?
No, same thing. It only becomes important when you're not traveling in the continental U.S. Now, there are some exceptions to that. If you're in a facility that is on the border, either the north or south border of the United States, then there might be a time that, yes, you need to specify, are you going to Brownsville, Texas, or are you going into Mexico? But around this area, you're perfectly fine leaving out the kilo.
Got it. Okay, well, good. Yeah, I think you'd mentioned too at some point, because we have airports around here like Kilo 62, where Kilo is part of the 3-letter identifier or 3-character identifier. So I could see how that could trip you up a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk about some towered airport operations, and this really initially kind of focuses on Class D airports. We'll kind of get into some nuts and bolts here. First question: a controller tells me to report a 3-mile base. That seems kind of vague. How should I judge my distance? Distance from what? As far as how I should report that 3-mile base to the tower controller.
Well, that's where we've gotten spoiled by GPS and ForeFlight and all these other technologies that we have in the cockpit. And vice versa, it's also why we've gotten spoiled in the air traffic world of full radar coverage a lot of places now. It is a checkpoint for us. So if you are not able to do that, definitely let the controller know immediately. I don't have a way to judge 3 miles. Another way is familiarize yourself before you come into a Class Delta airport. Look at the sectional and try and definitely get a sense of distances, 1, 2, 3, 4 miles from the runway threshold, and kind of see where those checkpoints are. But if you don't know, tell the controller.
Okay, and is a bigger airport, is the controller basing that on the threshold then, not the center of the airport?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. I think that's a point of confusion too. When you get to some of the airports, with lots of runways and spread out, like even with GPS, not that we're flying into Denver, obviously, but they can span 4 or 5 miles across, and that can make a difference.
Yeah, a 3-mile base is a mile inside the threshold. Yeah, that wouldn't be very good, but definitely do it off the threshold of the runway.
Okay, good advice. Another question, I've had this one before too, especially at some of the busier training airports,
Mhm.
California, Northeast up towards Boston. Say, there's a lot of training aircraft in the pattern. I'm on a short final and I need to go around due to an aircraft on the runway or any other reason. Um, what is the controller expecting if he's issuing lots of clearances, other airplanes and helicopters, et cetera? What is he expecting me to do when I go around? And let's say I was issued a long final and I haven't been cleared left or right traffic, and I don't hear anything from the controller. What's the expectation on that go around to come back around?
The go around is, well, if you're on an instrument procedure, you're going to perform the instrument go around procedure. The the controller should give you instructions pretty quickly. The controller should recognize that that is happening and give you alternate instructions, either sidestep left, sidestep right, runway heading, climb and maintain 3000. There should be instructions out of the controller's mouth pretty rapidly. If you don't know that, that's one of those times to key that mic and say, I'm going around, say intention, or give them your intentions or ask them what they want immediately. That's one of those
Okay.
times you need to break in.
But you shouldn't go ahead and fly a left or right pattern based on other flows. Wait for the controller to give you explicit
Correct.
instructions.
Correct. Yeah. Wait for those, ask for those instructions if you weren't given them.
Okay. Now after landing at an airport again, say it's busy and there's a handful of taxiways and even runways, what's your expectation on getting off the runway? Should I keep on driving down to the closest taxiway to my FBO, or should I get off as soon as possible? What's the expectations there from the tower controller?
The expectation is you're going to get off at the first available exit at your taxi speed and exit the runway safety area, which is the dashed line of the taxiway to the runway there. That two solid, two dashed line. You need to clear, your tail needs to physically clear that line before the next aircraft is allowed to operate. So it is imperative that you cross fully over that line so that we can continue operations. And then you clear whichever way towards your FBO. It is not uncommon, and you are allowed to ask, can I roll long to the FBO? Make sure to ask that ahead of time. Don't ask that while you're on the runway.
Okay,
That's
got it.
just
Yeah,
my
so
opinion.
yeah, plan ahead. No, if you're in a 172, but it's 4,000 feet down the runway, don't just do it on your own. And even and plan. Now let me ask you that: is it okay if I'm on, I report that 3 mile base or 2 mile final to tell you that at that point of which FBO I'm going to maybe help you plan ahead?
Yes, absolutely. Encourage it.
Okay, so I think
You'll
some
hear the
pilot.
air carrier. You'll hear the air carriers too. If anybody here is monitoring live ATC, or maybe you're going out to an airport viewing area with a handheld and listening, you'll hear air carriers ask, do you mind if we roll to the end? Do you mind if we hit this taxiway? You'll hear it all the time from the professional pilots as well.
Okay, just don't do it on your own without, of course, talking and expressing your intentions.
Yeah, that when you miss the taxiway we think you're hitting, it can change air traffic plans real quickly.
Right, and then nobody's happy.
Yeah.
Let's talk about departing a Class D airport. So we'll assume here that we're calling ground control for our VFR
All right.
clearance. Uh,
Mhm.
what's what do you expect in terms of, because that controller obviously doesn't have a radar facility directly attached to it, but if I do want to fly through the Class Bravo airspace nearby, or I want flight following, can I relay that to the local Class D controller?
You can relay that request. It depends on the airport configuration, letters of agreement, and sometimes the relationship between the facilities over whether or not that will be directly passed to the Bravo, the Class Bravo facility. So let's use once again our local example of Lunken. You call Cincinnati Lunken and you say, I want VFR flight following to CVG inside of Class Bravo airspace. Cincinnati Lunken is going to give you the your beacon code, your clearance, your departure frequency, all your information, your altitude to maintain, just like normal. And they will relay that information to CVG that this individual wants Class Bravo services. Now, if it's near a Class Charlie, let's say Bowman, Louisville Bowman to Louisville Standiford, uh, once you meet the Class Charlie requirements, you are cleared through that airspace. So also, near Cincinnati, once you meet the Bravo requirements, you're cleared in that airspace. But in a Bravo, that does require you to obtain a clearance into the Class Bravo airspace, where a Charlie is obviously a little more lenient. So make sure that you meet those even though you've talked to the Class Delta facility, unless explicitly told you are cleared into the Charlie or the Bravo airspace, you have not done so with that facility.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Brett? Did I
It
explain
does,
that
yeah.
well? Okay,
You did,
perfect.
and Lunken's a good example here, and from my experience, they've been very helpful. I know at training flights that if
Mhm.
we call ground control for that initial VFR clearance and let them know we'd like flight following, or again clearance to the Bravo for going westbound, let's say, that they just like when they're
Mhm.
coordinating with IFR departures, that they can coordinate with the group at the TRACON at your facility to then get that out. And if I remember correctly, they'll even give you, like you said, a squawk code from
Oh, yes.
Lunken Tower that's relayed from the Class B facility.
Correct. Yes, they get all that information and they're really good about passing it. Now, I can speak to that one. I can't speak to, well, let's use St. Louis as your example. I don't know what their procedures are, just what's the procedure between Lunken and Cincinnati.
Sure. I think the takeaway too is to ask the ground controller if that's an option on that initial call
Bingo.
up. Um,
Always. And you'll
well,
get that a lot in this presentation. Ask. If you don't know, ask. It's that simple.
got it. Now, what about a student pilot? Because a lot of pilots, there's flight schools here at Lunken. Again, we kind of use that as our
Mhm.
example here. What's your take on pilots identifying themselves as student pilots from the controller's perspective and how they treat them differently? Is it an annoyance or is it actually helpful for the controller?
I definitely wouldn't call it an annoyance. Uh, I've heard some students that say student in every single transmission. I don't know if that's needed. I like when the student tells me they're a student in maybe the first transmission, and I'll write that down that this individual is a student pilot. So I have the information there for all subsequent transmissions. Uh, that helps us know your capabilities, and it kind of lets us know, pay really close attention to this individual. They might need help down the road. Not that we're not paying you more attention than anyone else. It just gives us a little heads up. Uh, so there's nothing wrong with telling a controller you're a student pilot.
Good. And I hadn't thought about that, right? I'm sure you've heard everything, but just like at a non-towered airport where we make, radio calls and we say where we're at every single time, what airport, I can see how that might translate over to saying I'm a student pilot every time. And that's a great piece of advice that not
Mhm.
necessary. Once you say it the first time, the controller is going to kind of classify your flight and act accordingly. Now, as far as transitioning a Class D airport, and this might apply to really C or B, and maybe not, you can clarify. But if we're overflying the airspace by a safe margin, first off, what do you think is kind of a common courtesy in terms of that buffer flying over top of, I don't want to say Cincinnati Class B because that's 10,000 feet, but maybe up in Dayton or Columbus, a Class C
Mhm.
airspace, or a Class D. What's a good kind of rule of thumb and guidance that you would give to pilots who don't feel comfortable talking to ATC but still want to fly over top the airspace and stay out of it?
My rule of thumb when I am flying is 1,500 feet. There's a reason for that. Aircraft climbing off of the primary airport are usually climbing to the top of the Charlie airspace. So let's use Columbus. Since you brought Columbus up, Columbus Tower automatically climbs to 5,000 feet. If you're at 5,500, because I I'm going by memory here, I believe their Class Charlie goes up to 5,000. I might be incorrect in that, and do forgive me, but it's a good example. If their Charlie goes up to 5,000 and you're at 5,500, you're illegal going over them. However, the turbojet aircraft climbing off of Columbus rapidly to 5,000 might get a TCAS resolution advisory off of your aircraft that forces them to descend back down. At 1,500, you're giving it enough of a buffer that you won't set off the TCAS equipment. Now, are you perfectly legal at 5,500 over a 5,000? Absolutely. But it does give a little bit of a buffer to help both aircraft.
That's an excellent point. I honestly didn't think of that. And just to kind of a little more information, the TCAS system, when a pilot of that turbine aircraft gets that, they have to respond to it. It's not like seeing an
Correct.
airplane in flight or another transponder interrogation tool in a GA cockpit. They get that alert and they gotta make a move, laterally or vertically. So it's more than just a legal thing. It's a courtesy thing, and
Absolutely.
it'll spill the tray tables and iPads and iPhones on all the passengers at the same time. So that's good. That's really good advice. I think some pilots are even asking, "Can I fly as close as 100 or 200 feet?" Thinking more along the lines of accuracy of their transponders and what's ATC looking at? Am I going to get in trouble? but I think that's a much more practical answer. And I'm sure you would say the best answer is to talk to the controller so they can know what you're doing and what your plans are.
I am a huge proponent of flight following. The pilot I can't help is the one I'm not talking to. The pilot, and the last thing you want is if you're in a situation where you need assistance, that you're fumbling for a frequency or someone to contact. So if you're already talking to somebody, there's somebody else in the cockpit with you, and that's a great resource to have. So that's my first thing with flight following. Another one is, where is the traffic? ForeFlight might not see everyone. We have additional resources. We have multiple radar sites. Flight following is your friend. It's also going to get you more comfortable talking to air traffic.
Okay, since you brought up flight following, I'm going to skip out of order here because I know that's a very popular topic. If you're ready to dive into that one,
Go
we'll
for it.
come back to Class B here in a minute because I think it's all related, obviously, in terms of what we're
Yes,
doing. So that was my first question. I'm going to give you the the green light to say it again. Do controllers appreciate pilots using flight following service, or is it more of a burden because
100%.
it increases their workload?
It is rarely a burden. There are times that it is, and if it is a burden, air traffic does reserve the right to not provide flight following. But most of the time, it gives us better situational awareness. We know who you are. We're talking to you. We're able to exchange traffic. To me, it provides a more comfortable, safer environment. Thank you, Brett. As an example, so this is an actual radar scope. There is a target off to the right side of the screen. On my screen, it's about right, just right of the middle. It says 037. That is an aircraft that's not talking to air traffic. The other ones with the 2 to 3 lines, those are aircraft that are talking to air traffic. So the 3700 might be in a position where I need to talk to them. What are your intentions? Are you climbing? Are you descending? What if there's a jet going into Lunken and I need to descend on top of you? I need to know what you're doing and vice versa. If I'm not talking to you, either A, I have to provide a greater margin buffer around you, um, and it does create some confusing circumstances for controllers. If I'm talking to you, I can ask what you're doing and hopefully help you out if there is the need for an emergency. That's a big one that I cannot stress enough. If you're in an emergency situation, the last thing you want to try to do is find a frequency for where you are.
Now, does that differ at all? Because we're looking at a terminal screen here from Cincinnati, Class B.
Oh yeah.
Based on your, yeah, explain the difference in terms of center versus, as it relates to flight following, center versus a terminal Class B or C controller.
A terminal radar system, and I'm going to talk pre-ADS-B and post-ADS-B because those are two very important distinctions. Pre-ADS-B especially, terminal radar systems were much faster. The terminal dish is a little smaller, but it turns much more rapidly because it's covering a smaller geographical area. Center radars are gigantic dishes that cover a large geographic area. They turn very slowly in comparison. Even before ADS-B, depending on the amount of radar sites, terminal controllers would get an update every second of a target. Recently, that's now with ADS-B, it really is amazing what all we can see and what capabilities we have. Where we used to have radar coverage everywhere, now ADS-B is really supplementing that and providing a lot more capabilities on our side. Same for center controllers. They can see a lot more. Those large center radars, as the cone went out from the radar site, they might not have good coverage to the ground. Now with ADS-B, they're getting more coverage on there. But the one disadvantage the center still has is a very slow update rate. So every second your target's updating in the terminal environment, a center target could only update maybe once every 12 seconds. So there's a little more tools to compensate for that. But now with ADS-B, we've got really great radar coverage out there, especially in the contiguous US.
Okay, yeah, that is interesting. I hadn't thought about that, like you said, with the center controllers and the sweep of the radar. You know, going back to the pre 2020 or even I guess 2015, before a lot of GA pilots equipped.
Yeah.
So as far as flight following goes, do the center controllers? I mean, is that something they appreciate as well, where the air traffic
I
spaced
did.
out a lot more?
I always did. As a center controller, sometimes more so, because I was on the northeast corner of Dallas, Fort Worth Center, working the Northeast arrivals into DFW, into Dallas Love. It was a great tool for me if there was an aircraft in the arrival corridor, VFR at a bad VFR altitude. If I'm talking to them, I can say, maybe descend 1,000 feet or turn a little bit. Where if I wasn't talking to them, there were a lot of jet aircraft that might have been in their way, or we might have had to move jet aircraft around that individual. Where if I was talking to them, all we needed was 1,000 feet and they can move. And we see that occasionally.
Okay. Another concern with flight following, and I think it might be some of the intimidation and not wanting to make a mistake or sound like you don't know what you're talking about. But the first step, obviously, is finding a frequency to talk to and make that initial communication. And especially outside of your local area, you probably know your local controller's frequency and the satellite airport frequency. But what's your suggestion on finding the correct frequency? And if for some reason I can't and I call the wrong one, is that still okay? Can they transfer me? What's the process there, and what you recommend for how to go about that, especially in unfamiliar airspace?
Right. If you're in an unfamiliar airspace, first make sure to look at the chart before you depart. Make sure to look at your flight aware, the departure frequency or the clearance delivery frequency, if there's one on the ground, will be a good first frequency for you. If you're airborne and want flight following at that point, it is on the AFD, I believe, for flight. You can just tap and it'll tell you what frequencies are near. If you have an idea, you can contact them. And if they say, hey, you're not in my airspace, ask them if they know the frequency of where you should be.
Okay, because they could probably, that's another question. Can the controller, even if it's not his sector or her sector, can they still find you on the screen somewhere, maybe if you ident, or can they go about that process?
Absolutely.
Or okay,
Absolutely. We can give you a discrete code no matter where you are. And a discrete code means not 1200. So if I gave you 4567, you can dial in 4567, and I've already typed your call sign in, and you're going to pop up on the scope. And that's going to show me exactly where you are, and then we're going to ask you to ident.
perfect. And if you're not in that controller sector, they can then give you a frequency change probably to the correct controller.
Correct. Correct.
Now, what about once established, we're VFR flying and we want to change altitude or change heading, whatever it might be? Are we required to report those changes to you during flight following?
It's funny. That's a very, very interesting question that we've been having a lot lately. It is very nice if you ask or tell us what you're doing. Hey, I need to climb, I need to descend. The FARs, it's Class E airspace, so you have to comply with the Class E airspace rules or whatever class of airspace you're in at the time. You are responsible for complying with those rules. So if our instructions contradict that, let air traffic know immediately, because it's your responsibility to conduct that aircraft in the rules of the Part 91 or 135 or whatever part you're doing of the FARs. So please let air traffic know, though, because we're expecting something, and a lot of our decisions are based on the information that we have at the time.
Okay, makes sense. Last question on flight following that came up related to frequency changes and even handoffs. Sometimes if we're leaving Cincinnati, we might get flight following through the Cincinnati airspace and the limits of 30, 40 miles out, and then they say frequency change approved, suggest contacting this facility. Other times we get a handoff to the center or the next approach control. What kind of dictates that in terms of how we get entered in the system?
There's a lot of things in that. If you requested flight following to a specific destination when you requested your flight following, most controllers are going to put that into the system and keep it. Let's say, once again, you're off of Claremont County, Sporties, India 69. So you're departing India 69 and you want flight following to London, Kentucky. We're going to put the flight, and you tell us, I'd like flight following from Claremont County to London, Kentucky. We're going to type that in the system. It immediately goes into the NAS, National Airspace System, and we get a flight plan on you, and it prints out for us, and we have it right there in front of us, and we'll retain that data. That also puts you in for processing. So it puts you in not only the Cincinnati system, but it just puts you in the Lexington approach control system, because they'll be the next facility if you stay low. And it also puts you in Indianapolis Center, which will be the third facility. So it simultaneously does that all at once, just like if you were IFR.
Okay, good.
Now,
So the
other
important
one
takeaway
is,
there is to tell the controller your destination, not just flight following in a general direction.
Right. Yeah. If you request flight following southbound, we don't really know where you're going. We'll just say radar service terminated, contact Lexington approach if you'd like further flight following to the south.
Let's switch gears here. We're going to talk a little bit about some IFR related questions and route planning, that kind of thing, and then we'll come back to our screens here. We have some more kind of in-depth and tighter shots of the radar screen for you to discuss a little more. But from an IFR pilot's perspective, we continually bring up GPS and ForeFlight and our tools we have, and we have more information now than ever in terms of seeing what other aircraft routes are filed between airports. I think the biggest question comes in and this probably is an open-ended question and we don't have to go into too much detail, but kind of give some general guidance. When should I file GPS direct from point A to point B versus doing some research and find airways or T routes or other kind of intersections, waypoints, etc. What kind of dictates that from what's practical in the ATC system and what you're actually going to get in a clearance?
I'm going to clarify your question real quick. IFR or VFR?
We're going to go IFR now. So this is
Okay,
a
let's
pilot
go
flying an IFR flight plan.
There's a few different things that dictate that. The main thing on the air traffic side, there are letters of agreement between every facility and every facility that facility touches. So let's say you started at Lunken. Lunken has a letter of agreement with Cincinnati that says that aircraft going in these directions will be on this route. Then Cincinnati has letters of agreement with Indianapolis Center. I'm acting like you're going into the flight levels here. They have letters of agreement with Indianapolis Center that dictate these aircraft will be on these routes. And then going into Indy Center, let's say you're going to Dallas Love Field. Indy Center has letters with Kansas City, who has letters with Memphis, who has letters with Fort Worth Center, who has letters with Dallas Approach, with Dallas Love Tower. Those letters are not readily available to the public. They change regularly, but the route system usually doesn't change unless there's a new arrival or departure. They usually match any departure procedures or arrival procedures, stars, SIDs and stars, at those airports. So if you're following the SID and you're following the star, that's a good place to start. The middle portion, I really like ForeFlight's previous route feature, the ones that'll tell you what other people have filed recently. I really love that feature because it is what air traffic cleared someone out recently. Make sure you're following the SID, make sure you're following the star, and the rest, sometimes it's just a guess.
Okay. And I think that's a common point, a point to clarify too. And let's say we're flying low level, 10, 12,000 feet between, I don't say rural airports, but we're not going into New York or Boston. We're flying Ohio to Illinois, and I file direct from a suburb here, Cincinnati, to somewhere in Illinois, and I file GPS direct. We still get that from time to time. Other times we don't. What dictates whether or not we get that GPS direct clearance? Is that an actual person making that call? Is it a computer? Or how does that work?
Once again, the answer is yes. Sometimes it is a person, it is a controller that might have a need to put you on a different route for some reason. Sometimes it's weather dictating that. And as I previously mentioned in my experience, traffic management. That's what traffic management does, is a lot of times they have to issue reroutes to manage airspace and weather constraints. So when there is a line of weather, we've all experienced it from Canada to Mexico, going right through the middle of the country. We have to plan routes that adapt to that. Another favorite one is down to Florida. Anyone that's flown to Florida recently knows with the thunderstorms and everything else going on down there, that they need you on a route. That is for airspace management purposes. Because if everybody just went GPS direct, one controller would have 1,000 aircraft and the next controller would sit there with 2. And so they kind of have to divide that out to make sure that everything is manageable, that no one is getting overloaded at a sector. And that's what a lot of those are for. Now, those can be easily found. If you Google air traffic restrictions, you can easily find those out. The Northeast is a good one.
That's good advice, especially the weather part of it. Today where it's 130 degrees outside and high pressure and blue skies forever, flying direct to Illinois out of Cincinnati might work out just fine. But the second you start getting, and things you can't even see, right? Other air traffic flows around Indianapolis or Chicago, could dictate that. So it's not always going to be black and white, the same thing every time. And I think that's a great
Never.
point, being flexible. And I want to reiterate what you said, because I teach this with my students and all of our training programs, that previously cleared routes feature in ForeFlight. Garmin Pilot has that. Whenever you don't know an unfamiliar airspace or a new routing, and you're concerned about filing direct but getting that dreaded full route clearance, the best way to prepare for that is to look at that previous route, and you'll even see how many times it was used by their airplanes at your altitude. So you're not just looking at 37 or flight level
Correct.
370. You can find a Bonanza that probably flew that route at 10,000 feet. Go ahead and file it, plan for it, prepare for it. And I'll tell you, every time I've done that in the system all across the U.S., I've gotten that exact route probably 99% of the times, and that just
And
makes everybody's
altitude
life
is
so
a
much
key
easier.
to it. I didn't hit the altitude portion of it. A lot of times altitude does play into that. The lower aircraft, the lower you are, especially if you're going what we call tower en route. So if you're going from Cincinnati through Columbus, through Indianapolis, through Fort Wayne, approach control beneath the center, a lot of those sometimes are so low that they don't overwhelm the higher altitude stratums, that there might not be routing on those lower altitudes. That's something to consider as well. But once again, that is facility dependent and weather dependent. There are a lot of dependencies there.
Again, as we talk about technology and the affordability that us pilots have, we can equip our cockpit with a portable ADS-B receiver for less than $1,000 for flight. We've got near real-time weather, and that's kind of my question to you, honestly, is in a great perspective from the pilot standpoint and the controller standpoint, because you've seen what we pilots have on the ADS-B weather side and Sirius XM.
Mm-hmm.
Versus what we're looking at here, and I'll let you go into this a little bit more. But explain, I guess, first, what kind of weather capabilities the controllers have, and I know this is another loaded question because you have TRACON and Center has different equipment. But what are the controllers seeing, and what's their, or what should the pilot's expectations be in terms of the controller giving us routing around weather versus us having to kind of make that call on our own?
Wow, yes, very loaded question. So let's start with what we're seeing here. This is the weather depiction off of a radar scope. Um, Light is the normal general blue without any dots in it. Light precipitation is indicated there by the red line. Moderate, heavy, and extreme. There's no extreme on this. It would be a very solid kind of a greenish color on the scope. That's what a terminal controller is going to see. The center radar has less stratification in that. They just have a larger piece of the puzzle, and it's not as stratified on the center scope. The big thing to remember, if you have onboard weather radar, if you're actually using a radar dish in your aircraft, our system is a lot more powerful. We're using gigantic radar dishes that are extremely powerful to beam through this weather and really get a great depiction of what the weather is showing us. We're able to see embedded thunderstorms. We're able to see what's on the other side of the precipitation that you see. A lot of radar equipped aircraft will only see the front side of the weather system. So we're able to see through it. So we're able to give you a better picture, especially if you ask, what are you seeing on the other side of it? That being said, controllers should tell you, area of light, moderate, heavy, and extreme precipitation, 12 o'clock, 5 miles, 25 miles wide. If you need a deviation and we have an offer and you want to ask for it, definitely ask for it. Don't put yourself in a situation that you don't want to be in. Now, NextRide is actually one of the products we use. We use NextRide in the air traffic environment, and that's what you are showing on your tablet, on your Garmin system. There's so many systems on your ADS-BN system, and that's giving pilots a great opportunity to see what we're seeing, and it's really exciting to see that. I was told recently that even regional jet pilots are now flying with ADS-B receivers and iPads to be able to see the weather presentation that you're getting.
But so that's a great point. So what, based on your experience then, and you've been controlling aircraft before and after, pilots having this weather technology in the cockpit, what are you seeing in terms of pilots' preparation and their role in this process versus the years of 15 years ago when ATC was the primary guidance for GA airplanes and weather avoidance?
There seems to be better awareness in the cockpit. Pilots seem to have a better picture of what's going on. However, I would still like to see more improvement of not pre-duty weather briefing. That's what we do as controllers, of pre-briefing, going through the steps. If you're, we very rarely do pilots call flight service anymore, and we know that, but take the time to brief your flight and know what is out ahead of you. The last thing you want to do is end up in a situation that you don't want to be in or are not comfortable in. Now, pre-duty weather briefing, let's talk about that. I meant to talk about that on the slide before, Brett, and I apologize. One of the questions on the screen was, what does a controller do to prepare? And the first thing every controller in the country does when they get to work is a pre-duty weather briefing. That's how important weather is. We are required, before we talk to one aircraft for our shift that day, to know what the weather's going to be. And that should be the same for the pilot side, in my opinion, as well.
Great advice there. Now, along those lines, you mentioned we're not talking to flight service, and flight watch is gone. So really, ATC is the primary reception point for pilot reports or PIREPs. And that's tricky, right? Because the controllers are busy with air traffic. Now there's times in the center and, lower volume times that there is dead time on the frequency. But how do you prioritize? Again, we'll kind of relate here to the Cincinnati Class B terminal area. How do you prioritize and classify a value, et cetera, time on the radio for a pilot to issue a pilot report versus the routine communications of vectors and headings and that kind of thing? So should pilots feel comfortable and want to give the controller a PIREP?
100%, absolutely. Now, what I don't need, everybody has seen the standardized PIREP report, that there's an FAA form for it. I don't need the top. I know where you are. I know your type aircraft. I want to know what you're in. Are you in moderate turbulence? I need to know that, because I want to tell the guy behind you. Are you in moderate precipitation but smooth ride? That's valuable for that next aircraft. We need that information from you to know what this is, because you can see aircraft flying through that moderate precipitation right there. That day it might be smooth. Tomorrow that moderate precipitation might have bad turbulence in it, and we need to know that information, and you're the only one that has that information. It is not turbulent at all in the chair and the radar room.
That's a great point. I think it goes back to the value of the tour again, for the pilots to see how sterile in a environment compared to the cockpit, which can be bumpy and is bumpy and loud and very dynamic environment. Along those lines, so if I have moderate turbulence, or I just have one element to share that's important, and I say, hey, I'm in moderate turbulence, or I'm picking up light rime ice, will the controller, is that enough? Again, if the frequency is busy, is that enough for the controller to go ahead and input an official pilot report,
Yes.
or is that just going to be used for other aircraft in the area verbally?
No, we're both. We're gonna pass it verbally, and we're gonna fill out a PIREP report. If you reported icing like that, we are gonna ask you the outside air temperature. We do have to have both those pieces of information, but we already know your altitude. We know your type aircraft. We know your location, because you're talking to air traffic already. So we don't need the top portion. We know what time it is. We've got that. All we need to know is your flight condition. And that's why the phraseology for a controller is say flight conditions.
Gotcha.
That's
I think
that's
a disconnect in the training environment versus reality, that we see that pilot or PIREP form, and that dates back to the flight service days. But I think a lot of times pilots feel like that there's not enough time for them to read all 12 boxes to the controller, then they're not going to issue a PIREP, so I'm not going to share the information. So I think the key takeaway is express, even if just 1 point or 2 points. I know I like to give the tops reports a lot, climbing over or climbing out of here, IFR, or in the bases. I think that's helpful information, both locally
and
and for other pilots.
As air traffic controllers, we are required, there are requirements for us to get and disseminate PIREP reports in certain conditions.
Yeah, takeaway, you should not feel intimidated to do that, and in fact, it's
No,
encouraged.
I give one every time I fly.
I'm going to switch gears back to IFR. We're kind of talking IFR a little bit, but let's talk about IFR clearances first out of a non-towered airport. Do you prefer pilots to call the RCO, so like a remote communications frequency? Do you prefer them to call on the telephone? Let's start with that question, telephone versus RCO, or is there really a difference as far as the controller goes?
There's a little bit of difference. If the RCO is good, I'm speaking to you, Claremont County. If the RCO is good, then I prefer the RCO, just because it's usually more direct and a quicker form of communication. But the telephone is perfectly fine. You're calling the telephone behind the controller most of the time.
Okay, and I think from my standpoint, I keep the telephone number just on standby on my phone just in case, because that frequency can go out from time to time. Now, what about a VFR
Absolutely.
today? Flying IFR, it's severe clear or high overcast. What's the controller's take on getting the clearance on the ground versus departing VFR and picking it up airborne?
Picking it up in the air is usually quicker, but I will warn you with that, if the controller is extremely busy, you might not get your clearance when you expect it. So it is usually faster because we can give an abbreviated clearance. We don't have to do the whole, you're released at this time, clearance void if not up at this time. You're already in the air. So it's give them the squawk code, ident, radar contact, cleared. So it's a little quicker, but there is the caveat, if they have other duties, the instruction to you might be maintain VFR. But we can't give you your IFR right now.
So a lot of questions come in terms of tolerances. If I'm flying, we're assuming IFR again, in Cincinnati, and you cleared me to 4,000 feet. I'm flying along, I look over and I'm at 4,100 feet, and I push the control back over, get back down to 4,000. What kind of tolerance do I have in the eyes of the controller, both from a courtesy standpoint and then also any kind of legal action that you might need to take?
The instruction is 4,000 feet, so you're expected to maintain 4,000 feet. We allow up to 300-foot buffer for mode C compliance. So there is, we consider a mode C to be valid if it's less than 300 feet. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So let's say that happens,
Yeah.
then what's your reaction then? Are you gonna say or talk to the pilot about equipment, or what are you doing, or what's your kind of course of action when you see that then?
If you're in tolerance, nothing will be said to you if you're in tolerance.
Okay, I know this is the next topic's one you want to cover. So I go to 4,500 feet now, so I'm really out of spec and lost situational awareness, and I'm out of that tolerance now. What happens at that point?
You're probably going to hear the phrase possible pilot deviation. Advise you contact X approach at this phone number. That it does happen. It's called the Brasher warning. It does actually have a name. If you do get a Brasher warning when you land, call the facility. You can let them know what happened, but what they are doing is they are forwarding a mandatory occurrence report, what we call an MOR. They've probably already filled that out and they're waiting for the pilot information input. The person you talk to will probably just get your name, phone number, address, and certificate number if you're a certified pilot. That information goes out of the facility. At that point, it is forwarded to out of the air traffic world into the FSDO world. To be honest, I don't really know what happens there. Most of the time, from what I am understanding, is they're going to have a conversation with you just to see what the factors were. I highly anticipate you fill out a NASA report if that happens, and just say, what was going on in the cockpit, because there's a lot of human factor stuff in the cockpit that we need to know about in aviation.
Okay, that's good advice. And I think a lot of questions do come back to, can I call the controller and talk myself out of it? Well, you and the controllers are not the judge and jury. You're just
No,
strictly
a lot of
collecting the
people
data.
don't realize that controllers are not the police.
Right.
That goes to a different entity altogether.
Common question coming to IFR approaches, and this comes into the training environment. We're practicing instrument approaches. Do you prefer that the pilots in a training environment file an IFR flight plan to hop around to 3 or 4 different airports versus calling up ATC in the air and to do that VFR?
It is easier for the controller if you've already filed a flight plan, because we already know what you're wanting to do, and then we can if you are IFR, file the flight plan, and then we have the information. We have a lot of the information there ready, and we can give you your discrete beacon code quickly and get you on your way. It's a little faster.
Okay.
And once again, that's my opinion. Now, if you're VFR, sure, call us in the air. And this is for any flight following request, anything. I will say this real quickly. Give me your call sign first. First transmission, I just want your call sign. November 536 Sierra Papa. And when the controller has time, they're going to say November 536 Sierra Papa, go ahead. Yes, I would like flight following today from Claremont County Airport to the London Airport. I'm at Cessna 172 and I'll be at 3,500 feet. That's what we need.
This next part goes for practices or actual instrument approaches. depending on the busyness of the terminal area. If you're given radar vectors and you're expecting radar vectors to join the final approach course, but you actually haven't been given that clearance yet, but you can see the localizer or the GPS LPV final approach course is active and centering, can I still go ahead and join that, or what's your recommendation there if you're taken through the final approach course but not given that final clearance yet?
So the expectation is that you'll fly on the previous clearance given. So even though you're crossing the final approach course, you should still, if you weren't told to intercept, keep flying that heading. Now, there's a caveat to that. Ask before you get to the intercept point. Hey, would you like me to intercept? Because sometimes they might have thought that they gave you the intercept and hadn't. So do ask if you think that there's doubt, but keep on flying the present heading. The controller, if they need it for spacing, should tell you expect vectors across final for spacing or for some other reason.
Okay.
But do keep flying that present heading as cleared.
Good. The next one is one I'd like to cover with students, but I'd like to hear your perspective on it. So when we file an IFR flight plan at the destination, there's obviously weather requirements that dictate that we file an alternate airport. And many times the alternate airport meets the requirements of the regs, but we have another one in mind that, because when we get there, we can go to any airport we want to, right? We don't have to follow exactly what our alternate says. So what kind of guidance do you have, in that low weather, and I get to my destination and I'm kind of on the fence and, I do have to go missed approach. When should I start communicating with the approach or center controller about that alternate airport and how it relates to what I filed versus what's practical at that point?
So finding the filed alternate airport in air traffic is actually a little bit difficult. That information is not readily available at a terminal controller's fingertips. A center controller does have a little more capabilities to find that information. So a lot of the times we don't know what your alternate is readily, and we will ask you, what is your alternate? Or you may offer it, my alternate is Lunken. And then we'll say cleared to Lunken via direct, or we'll ask what routing do you want, or we might give you routing. But do tell us where your alternate is, because they might have the information in front of them, but don't bet on it. It's a little hard to find.
Yeah, that's what I had heard too, is that on the electronic strip, or even the older days of paper strip, that wasn't in front of the controller. They don't know what you filed. So you need to be more practical at that point. 2 or 3 hours into your flight, obviously a lot has changed since then. So pick the most appropriate airport at that time at your or near your destination for that alternate plan.
Absolutely.
Now let's say the other way. Now we're coming in. It's nice. We're on an IFR flight plan, but the weather's VFR, and I would like to cancel IFR. I have the airport in sight, or it's 20 miles out. It's clear. Does the controller prefer, again, from a workload standpoint, for me to stay on that IFR flight plan into the airport, or does it free up his resources if I cancel early and make it easier on the controller?
It definitely frees up resources. It gives us a little more capabilities if you're VFR in that area. I'll personally ask if I see a lot of traffic in the pattern or in the area, maybe in the practice area. I might say IFR cancellation received, but stay with me for traffic advisories for just a bit. Something like that to let you know there's traffic out there that I want you to know about, and I still want to talk to you. Now you can come back and say, you know what, we'll change over to advisory frequency. Roger, change advisory frequency to approved. But there are circumstances where you might want to still talk to air traffic, but canceling IFR does free up a lot of resources.
Right, so kind of a two-way street there, that we can cancel IFR, stay with you, which allows you maybe to get another IFR aircraft out of the airport, especially at non-towered airports, but then you can still track us or the inbound aircraft and give traffic advisories.
Absolutely.
Last question we have kind of looks to the future. So right now we're using communication via VHF radios, technology that's 60, 70 years old to communicate. And we hear about next gen and what's coming next, and we're experiencing that now with ADS-B. And me personally, I hear on the center, Datacom is said. I don't really know what it means. I think I know what it means, but it's kind of that next kind of electronic communication, which makes sense, for efficiency and that kind of thing. How do you see that technology as it's being tested now in the turbine flight decks, making its way into GA cockpits for down low and lower altitudes and that kind of thing?
It's going to be a slower transition. GA is usually the last of the required entities to adapt a new technology like that, just because of the expense. I mean, those are very expensive technologies. What you're talking about, Datacom, is what we refer to commonly as CPDLC, controller pilot data link communications. I believe I got that one right. It is basically texting. It's two-way texting in the cockpit. We can send control instructions from the ground to the air. The pilot can acknowledge them and then perform the instruction from the cockpit. That is live at Indy Center right now for capable and equipped aircraft. So if your aircraft is capable and equipped, you'll register in the CPDLC system. It's more common in the oceanic environment. They have a different system there as well. I believe Europe is a little bit ahead on the CPDLC systems. Most pilots on this forum, the 200 of us that are left, the technology is mainly being used at the clearance delivery level. More people might be familiar with the PDC system. That is the departure clearance that you get. ForeFlight does have that capability. The PDC system and the CPDL system are very, very common, or very, very similar. Sorry about that, very similar. However, the CPDL system allows for two-way communications and editing, where the PDC system does not. So those systems are slowly coming online and being adapted, but it will take a while.
Okay, but it is the goal, though. I mean, can you see in 20,
Yeah.
30 years, having a Garmin G5 billion being able to text message to Indy Center, and I guess you get rid of, you still have handoffs, I guess, but because are you doing handoffs now with the turbine operators?
Yes. Yeah, it includes handoffs and everything, but it's more of an assumption of the target than anything.
Gotcha.
It's really a neat system. I actually was lucky enough to be on the human factor study for it. I had a brain scanner attached to my head and all sorts of stuff to see how controllers would react to it. It was really neat. It's a great technology that's really going to change how we do things.
Who benefits more from what you've seen, the pilots or the controllers?
I think it's equal. It cuts down on a lot of missed readbacks, both on the pilot side and the controller side. There's no more what did he say? It's, oh, there it is. That's what they want us to do. So I think it's going to help a lot.
I hate to say it, but it puts us one step closer to automation and pilotless cockpits, which none of us want to hear. But
who's gonna go first, us or you?
That's a great question. We'll leave that as the outstanding question for the day, and food for thought. On the final screen here, I had a couple guides here for communications, especially for those looking to learn more and kind of some of the basics. And I know we covered a lot of advanced topics today, both from an IFR standpoint and in terminal airspace. Kind of my three takeaways, what you can do right now for those learning is liveatc.net. Get online or on your iPad, just listen in, to communications. That's the best way, is just to immerse yourself at different airports and go anywhere in the U.S. and listen to them. From a tower standpoint, if you can drive to the airport with a handheld radio, that training is immensely helpful too, because then you can actually see the airplanes and helicopters, etc. Of course, communications training videos, and then some training guides put out by NATCA. Any other guidance you want to share as far as from a training resource?
I think another great training resource, and this one gets you wings credit as well, if anybody's interested in wings credit. RSAT meetings, Runway Safety Action Team. I'm going to do a real quick promotion on those. Every towered airport, either FAA or an FAA contract tower, is required to give one Runway Safety Action Team presentation a year. It is on the FAAST, the FAST website. You will get wings credit if you attend, but it's really going to immerse yourself in your home airport or your closest towered airport. You'll get to meet air traffic there. You'll get to meet the airport, and they really want input to make those airports safer. So definitely look at attending an RSAT, and that's what we call it, an RSAT meeting.
Okay, great advice. I know you've shared that with the group here at the airport and all the other terminal, or not terminal, but satellite airport operators in the area. Well, RJ, thank you very much, and thanks for the extra time here. This has been very informative. I know I learned a lot. Thank you, and on behalf of Sporties, we welcome and thank everyone for joining us today. Please visit sporties.com/webinars for future programs we have coming up. Everyone have a good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.